Every father carries secrets he prays his children will never discover. Some men take those secrets to their graves, believing silence is the greatest gift. 10 years ago, Buck Hanley rode into the Red Rock Desert with his dog Rufus and never came home. The desert had claimed another soul, or so everyone believed. But when settlers digging a well near Black Mesa uncovered Buck and Rufus lying side by side, perfectly preserved, it wasn't just their bones that surfaced. Hidden in Buck's satchel were letters that would shatter everything his family thought they knew. Buck's estranged daughter must now confront a past she never understood. What secret was so devastating that a man would choose to disappear forever rather than return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Morrison had always believed that distance could heal old wounds. 23 years of living in Denver, building a veterinary practice from nothing, raising a son alone. All of it had been an attempt to prove that she could thrive without the shadow of Mesa Ridge and the man who'd shaped her early. Years with equal measures of love and disappointment. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, just as she was reviewing lab results for Mrs. Henderson's aging golden retriever. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Tom Caldwell, though she hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in over a decade. "Emma, this is Tom Caldwell down in Mesa Ridge. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your father." Her hand tightened around the phone. "My father's been dead to me for 10 years, Sheriff. If this is about his property or some legal matter, Emma, we found him. We found Buck." The words hung in the autumn air of her Denver office like smoke from a distant fire. Through her window, she could see the Front Range mountains dusted with early snow, a sight that had comforted her for years because it looked nothing like the red rock country of her childhood. Now even those familiar peaks seemed to mock her with their permanence. "Found him where?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Near Black Mesa. Some new folks moved out that way, been trying to dig a well. They found remains, human and animal. The medical examiner confirmed it yesterday. It's Buck and Rufus, Emma. They were together." Emma closed her eyes and saw her 16-year-old self standing in the kitchen of the old ranch house, screaming at Buck about trust and abandonment, while her mother Sarah sat at the table quietly crying. That fight had been the last real conversation she'd had with her father. Everything after, the stilted phone calls, the awkward visits that grew less frequent until they stopped altogether, had been just two people going through the motions of being family. "How?" she managed to ask. "Can't say for certain yet. No obvious signs of violence. Medical examiner thinks they might have gotten caught in a flash flood, maybe took shelter in what turned out to be a wash. You know how those storms can be out here." Emma did know. She'd grown up hearing stories of experienced ranchers and hikers who'd been swept away by walls of water that appeared without warning in the desert. It was one of the ways the land reminded you that it didn't care about your plans or your experience. But Buck had known that country better than anyone. He'd been born in Mesa Ridge, had worked cattle in those canyons since he was Jake's age. "There's something else," Sheriff Caldwell continued, his voice gentler now. "He had some personal effects with him. Letters mostly. I think you should come down and take a look." After she hung up, Emma sat in her office for a long time, staring at the family photograph on her desk. It showed her and Jake last Christmas, both of them laughing at something Jake had said while they decorated their tree. Her son had her dark hair but his grandfather's eyes she'd spent years trying not to think about. Jake was 17 now, a senior in high school, with dreams of studying architecture at Colorado State. He'd asked about his grandfather exactly once. When he was 12 and working on a family tree project for school, Emma had told him that Buck lived far away and they didn't talk much. Jake had accepted this with the easy trust of childhood, but she knew he'd always wondered about the man whose name he carried as his middle name. The photograph from 1985 still lived in her jewelry box at home, though she hadn't looked at it in years. In it, Buck held 3-year-old Emma on his shoulders, while Sarah smiled up at them both, her hand shading her eyes from the afternoon sun. They were standing in front of the old barn, and Emma could remember the smell of hay and leather, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. Buck was wearing his best shirt and his sheriff's badge, proud to be photographed with his family on Easter Sunday. That was before everything went wrong. Before the drinking started in earnest. Before the long silences and the way Buck would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was checking on cattle or mending fences. Before the night he came home with scraped knuckles and wouldn't explain where he'd been. Before Sarah got sick and Buck seemed to retreat further into himself, as if grief was a place he could visit alone. Emma had left for college in Denver when she was 18, telling herself it was about education and opportunity. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. She'd been running from the weight of her father's disappointments, from the way he looked at her sometimes as if she reminded him of something he'd lost. The veterinary clinic had been her salvation and her pride. She'd started with nothing but student loans and determination, building a practice that specialized in large animals, horses, cattle, the working animals that reminded her of home, even as she tried to forget home existed. Her clients trusted her because she understood their lives, their attachment to creatures that were both livelihood and family. Now driving home through Denver traffic, she tried to imagine explaining to Jake that they needed to go to Mesa Ridge. Her son had never seen the place where she'd grown up, had never met the people who'd shaped her childhood. She'd told herself she was protecting him from the complications of her past. But maybe she'd been protecting herself instead. Her house in the Highlands neighborhood was a testament to the life she'd built without her father's help or approval. Modest but comfortable, with a small yard where she grew vegetables and herbs. Jake was in the kitchen when she arrived, making himself a sandwich with the easy confidence of a teenager who'd learned to be self-sufficient. "You're home early," he said, looking up from his sandwich construction. "Everything okay?" Emma set her keys on the counter and studied her son's face. He had Buck's thoughtful expression, the way his grandfather used to furrow his brow when he was working through a problem. It was unsettling how genetics could reach across years of silence and separation to assert themselves in the tilt of a jaw or the set of someone's shoulders. "I got a call today." "About your grandfather?" Jake's hands stilled on his sandwich. "The one in New Mexico?" "Colorado. Mesa Ridge. He's been found, Jake. He died out in the desert 10 years ago." She watched her son process this information, saw the questions forming in his eyes. Questions she wasn't sure she could answer without reopening wounds she'd spent decades trying to heal. "Did you know he was missing?" "I knew he'd left." "I didn't know he'd died." This wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. She'd known Buck was gone because the sporadic phone calls had stopped, because Sarah's funeral 5 years earlier had passed without any word from him. She'd assumed he'd finally done what he'd always threatened to do, disappeared into the desert country he loved more than he'd ever seemed to love his family. "Are we going to go there? For a funeral or something?" Emma pulled the family photograph from her purse, the one she'd removed from her jewelry box before leaving for work that morning without quite knowing why. She set it on the counter between them. "This is us," she said. "You were named after him." "Buck Hanley?" Jake picked up the photograph, studying it with the intensity he usually reserved for architectural drawings. "You look happy here." "We were for a while." "What happened?" It was the question she'd been dreading and expecting for years. How do you explain to a 17-year-old that love and disappointment could exist in the same space? That someone could be both the best and worst part of your childhood? That running away from your past didn't mean you'd escaped it? "It's complicated, Jake, but I think we need to go down there. I need to understand what happened to him." Jake nodded with the solemnity he'd inherited from Buck, though he'd never known his grandfather well enough to realize it. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow, if you can miss a few days of school." "I can miss school for family." The word hung between them. Family. Such a simple concept that had caused her so much trouble over the years. Emma looked at her son and saw Buck's determination, Sarah's kindness, and something that was entirely his own. Maybe that was what family really meant. Not the perfection of understanding, but the willingness to keep trying to understand. That night, Emma called the clinic to arrange coverage for the rest of the week. She packed clothes for high desert weather and hiking boots she hadn't worn in years. She found herself moving through these preparations with a sense of inevitability, as if the call from Sheriff Caldwell had simply been confirmation of something she'd always known would happen. Mesa Ridge was a day's drive south, through the mountains and down into the Red Rock country that had shaped her childhood and haunted her dreams. It was a place where the past lived in every canyon and wash, where secrets could lie buried for years before the wind and rain finally brought them to light. As she fell asleep, Emma thought about Buck and Rufus lying together in the desert silence. Keeper and kept, both of them finally at peace. Tomorrow she would begin the long journey back to a place she'd spent her adult life trying to forget, carrying questions that had waited 10 years for answers. Mesa Ridge looked smaller than Emma remembered, though she supposed that was how childhood places always appeared when viewed through adult eyes. The town straddled Highway 491 like a collection of afterthoughts, its buildings weathered to the same red dust color as the surrounding cliffs. The old trading post still anchored Main Street, its hand-painted sign faded but stubbornly legible. Beside it, the Mesa Ridge Cafe displayed a newer sign advertising "World's Best Green Chili," a claim that would have made Buck laugh. Jake pressed his face to the passenger window as they drove through downtown, taking in the wide spaces between buildings, the pickup trucks angle parked in front of the hardware store, the absence of traffic lights or franchise businesses. "It's like a movie set," he said, not unkindly. "It's real enough," Emma replied, pulling into the parking space in front of the sheriff's office. "Just different from what you're used to." Sheriff Tom Caldwell had aged well in the 15 years since she'd last seen him. His hair had gone completely gray, and his face showed the kind of deep lines that came from squinting into desert sunlight. But his handshake was still firm, and his eyes still held the patience that had made him a good sheriff and a better friend to Buck than her father had probably deserved. "Emma," he said, holding her hand a moment longer than necessary, "I'm sorry it took these circumstances to bring you home. This isn't my home anymore." "Tom?" He studied her face with the same careful attention he'd once given to accident scenes and disputed property lines. "Maybe not. But you're still Buck Hanley's daughter, and that means something around here." His office hadn't changed much either. The same metal desk, the same filing cabinets, the same topographical maps of the county pinned to the walls. What was new was the computer on his desk and the digital camera equipment stacked in one corner. Concessions to modern law enforcement that Buck would have grumbled about. "Tell me about the people who found him," Emma said, after she'd introduced Jake and they'd all settled into chairs around Tom's desk. The Parkers, David and Grace, along with their 2 teenagers. They bought 80 acres out near Black Mesa from the BLM last spring, been trying to establish a homestead. Off-grid folks, but the good kind, respectful, hard-working. They filed all the proper permits for the well. Tom pulled out a manila folder thick with photographs and reports. They were hand-digging old-fashioned style. Got down about 8 feet when Grace's shovel hit something that wasn't rock. Turned out to be Buck's belt buckle. Emma felt Jake tense beside her, though he said nothing. Her son had inherited her ability to stay quiet when processing difficult information, another trait that reminded her uncomfortably of Buck. They stopped digging immediately, called it in proper. David Parker used to be a paramedic before they moved out here, so he recognized what they'd found, handled everything respectfully. "And my father's things?" Tom opened the folder and carefully removed a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was Buck's weathered leather satchel, the same one he'd carried for as long as Emma could remember. Seeing it again brought back a flood of memories. Buck checking cattle records at the kitchen table, the satchel always within reach. Buck heading out to fix fences, the satchel slung over his shoulder. Buck sitting on the front porch in the evenings, reading letters from the satchel by the light of a kerosene lamp when the power was out. "We haven't gone through everything yet," Tom said. "Wanted you to be here for that." But there are letters, some personal items, and this. He removed another evidence bag, this one containing a tarnished sheriff's badge. Emma leaned forward, squinting at the engraving. Mesa Ridge County Sheriff, 1963. She read aloud. Tom, my father was never a sheriff. He was born in 55. He would have been 8 years old in 1963. Tom's expression grew thoughtful. That's what I thought too. But I did some checking in the old records. There was a Sheriff B. Hanley in 1963, but his first name was Benjamin, not Buck. Served less than a year before he was killed in a car accident on Highway 160. Buck's father, Jake said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since they'd arrived at the sheriff's office. Emma stared at her son, then at the badge. My father never talked about his parents. I always assumed they died when he was young, but he wouldn't discuss it. Benjamin Hanley left behind a wife and a son, Tom continued. The wife remarried a few years later, moved to Utah with her new husband. The boy would have been about 8. Buck, Emma whispered. Buck. Real name was Benjamin Jr., but I guess he went by Buck to distinguish himself from his father. The stepfather adopted him, gave him a new last name for a while. But when Buck turned 18, he legally changed it back to Hanley. Emma felt as if the ground beneath her chair had shifted. Her father had carried his own father's badge for more than 40 years, had never mentioned that he'd grown up as an orphaned sheriff's son. How many other secrets had he taken with him into the desert? There's more, Tom said, his voice gentle. The letters in the satchel, some of them are addressed to you. Emma's chest tightened. When were they written? Various dates. The most recent one is from about 6 months before he disappeared. She thought about that. Buck writing her letters he never intended to send, carrying them into the desert like some kind of penance or prayer. What words had he been trying to find? What explanations had he been rehearsing for a conversation that would never happen? I'd like to meet the Parkers, she said finally. The people who found him. I thought you might. I called Grace this morning, told her you were coming. She said they'd be honored to meet you. The drive to the Parker homestead took them deeper into the Red Rock country, past mesas and washes that Emma recognized from childhood adventures. The road was graded dirt, passable but rough, winding between sagebrush and juniper. Jake rode in silence, his window down despite the October chill, breathing in air that smelled of dust and distance. The Parker place was a modest collection of buildings, a small adobe house, a barn built from reclaimed lumber, solar panels glinting on a wooden tower. Grace Parker emerged from the house as they pulled up. A woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that spoke of honest work. You have his eyes, she said to Emma, after introductions had been made. I can see why David knew immediately that we'd found someone important. Grace led them to the well site, marked now with orange flags and crime scene tape. The hole had been carefully backfilled, but Emma could see the disturbed earth, the pile of removed soil, the place where her father had rested for 10 years while she built a life that deliberately excluded him. They were lying side by side, Grace said softly. Your father and the dog, peaceful, like they'd just decided to rest for a while. Emma knelt beside the filled-in hole, running her fingers through the red dirt. This was where Buck's story had ended, in a place that looked like dozens of other washes and arroyos scattered across the high desert. Nothing distinguished it except the presence of his bones and whatever secrets he'd carried into this lonely country. Why here? She asked, though she didn't expect an answer. Maybe he was heading somewhere specific, Jake suggested. Or maybe he was running from something. Emma looked at her son, surprised by the maturity in his voice. What makes you say that? The badge, the letters he never sent, the way he disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. Doesn't sound like someone who just wanted to go for a ride in the desert. Grace Parker nodded thoughtfully. David said the same thing. Said your father looked like he'd been traveling light but purposefully. Had supplies for several days, but not like he was planning to live out there permanently. As they drove back toward town, Emma found herself seeing the landscape differently. Instead of the harsh emptiness she'd remembered from childhood, she noticed the subtle signs of life, ancient petroglyphs on cliff faces, game trails worn into the sandstone, hidden springs marked by cottonwood trees. This wasn't a place where people came to die. It was a place where they came to find answers, or to face whatever they couldn't face anywhere else. That evening, sitting in her room at the Mesa Ridge Inn, the only hotel in town, Emma called her veterinary clinic to extend her stay indefinitely. She told herself it was about closure, about finally understanding the man who'd shaped her early years with such confusing intensity. But deeper than that was a growing certainty that Buck hadn't come out here to abandon his family. He'd come out here to protect them from something, and whatever that something was, it might not be buried as deeply as his bones. The key to the old ranch house still worked, though Emma had to wrestle with the lock for several minutes before the mechanism finally gave way. The front door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond, releasing the musty smell of a place that had been closed up and forgotten. Jake whistled low as they stepped inside. "This is where you grew up?" Emma nodded, though the house felt like a memory of itself rather than the actual place where she'd spent her childhood. The furniture remained. Her mother's rocking chair by the window, Buck's leather recliner positioned to command a view of the front yard, the dining table where they'd shared thousands of meals before everything went wrong. But dust sheets covered most of the surfaces, and the silence had a weight that spoke of years without human voices. "We should probably check with Tom about who owns this place now," she said, running her finger along the mantelpiece and leaving a track in the dust. "Actually, you do." Emma turned to find Grace Parker standing in the doorway, holding a manila envelope. "I hope you don't mind that I followed you out here. Tom asked me to bring you something. What do you mean I own it?" Grace handed her the envelope. "According to the county records Tom pulled, your father never sold the ranch. It's been sitting in some kind of legal limbo since he disappeared, but the deed is still in the Hanley family name. You're his only heir." Emma stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of unexpected inheritance. She'd spent 23 years assuming Buck had sold the ranch and squandered the money, another mark against him in her catalogue of grievances. The idea that he'd preserved this place had left it for her despite their estrangement, complicated the narrative she'd built about his abandonment. Tom also said you might want to look at the rest of your father's personal effects. "I brought them with me." Grace produced a plastic storage bin from her truck, the kind used for organizing closets or storing Christmas decorations. Inside were the contents of Buck's satchel, each item carefully bagged and labeled by Sheriff Caldwell. Emma felt Jake move closer as she began removing the bags, his curiosity overcoming his usual teenage reserve. The letters were wrapped in a rubber band that had deteriorated over the years. Emma counted 12 envelopes, all addressed to her in Buck's careful handwriting. The postmarks ranged from 2005 to early 2013, months before his disappearance. She opened the oldest one first, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the single sheet of notebook paper. "Emma," it began, "I've been trying to write this letter for months now, trying to find the words to explain why I've been such a poor father to you. There are things about my past that I've never told you, things that might help you understand why I am the way I am." The letter went on for half a page, but it was filled with the kind of general sentiments that might appear in any estranged parent's unsent correspondence. What struck Emma was how formal it sounded, as if Buck had been writing to a stranger rather than to the daughter he'd once carried on his shoulders. "He sounds different in these," Jake observed, reading over her shoulder. "More careful, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing." Emma opened the second letter, dated 6 months later. This one was shorter but more specific. Buck mentioned difficulty sleeping, strange phone calls that hung up when he answered, a sense that someone was watching the ranch. He wrote about checking the locks on the doors and windows, about feeling like he was living under a microscope. "Mom," Jake said quietly, "this doesn't sound like someone who was planning to abandon his family. This sounds like someone who was scared." Grace Parker had been quietly examining other items from the storage bin while Emma read the letters. Now she held up a clear plastic bag containing what looked like a hand-drawn map. Sheriff Caldwell said this was in your father's jacket pocket. It might be important. Emma set the letters aside and took the map. It had been drawn on survey paper in black ink, showing a rough outline of the Mesa Ridge area with several landmarks marked in Buck's handwriting. Black Mesa was there, along with Whiskey Creek, the old mine road, and several other locations Emma recognized from her childhood explorations. But what caught her attention were the red X's marked at various points across the map, each one accompanied by a date and a cryptic notation. Snake Wash, 7/15/82, she read aloud. Devil's Garden, 9/3/82, Bone Creek, 11/1/82. Those dates are from 1982, Grace said. More than 30 years ago. Emma studied the map more carefully, trying to decipher the pattern in Buck's markings. The red X's seemed to follow no obvious geographical logic. They were scattered across different drainages and mesas, connected only by what appeared to be game trails and old mining roads. What was happening in 1982? Jake asked. Emma thought back to her childhood, trying to remember what had been significant about that particular year. She would have been 5 years old, just starting kindergarten. Her memories from that time were fragmentary. Christmas morning, learning to ride her bicycle, the taste of her mother's apple pie. But she did remember that 1982 was around the time Buck had started working as a deputy sheriff before he'd fully committed to ranching. He was just starting in law enforcement then, she said. Maybe these locations have something to do with cases he worked. Grace pointed to one of the X's near the bottom of the map. This one's close to where we found him, maybe 2 miles northeast of the well site. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air filtering through the ranch house windows. If Buck had marked this location in 1982 but ended up dead near it in 2013, what had drawn him back after more than 30 years? We should go out there, Jake said, voicing what Emma was already thinking. Absolutely not, she replied automatically. We don't know what we're looking for, and it's easy to get lost out there. But if my grandfather was trying to tell us something, your grandfather is dead, Jake. Whatever he was trying to tell us, he took it with him. Even as she said the words, Emma knew they weren't true. Buck had left plenty of messages, in the letters, in the map, in the very fact that he'd preserved the ranch for her. The question was whether she had the courage to read those messages honestly, to follow the trail he'd left without knowing where it might lead. Grace Parker had been listening to this exchange with the patient attention of someone accustomed to family disagreements. Now she spoke with quiet authority. I've lived in places like this before, she said. Remote country where people have to look out for each other. Your father was trying to protect something or someone. Men don't carry their father's badge and draw maps like this unless they're planning to finish something important. Emma looked around the dusty ranch house, at the furniture draped in sheets like ghosts, at the empty picture frames on the mantelpiece where family photographs had once stood. This place held the story of her childhood, but it also held secrets she was only beginning to understand. All right, she said finally, but we do this carefully. We tell Tom where we're going, we take proper equipment, and we don't take any unnecessary risks, Jake grinned. And for a moment he looked exactly like Buck had at that age, eager for adventure, confident in his ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. Emma just hoped that confidence wouldn't prove as dangerous for her son as it had for her father. The storage unit in Mesa Ridge sat behind the hardware store, a collection of metal buildings that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts and good intentions. Emma had paid the monthly fee through an automated bank transfer for 8 years, without really thinking about what she was preserving. Her mother's belongings had been boxed up after the funeral, stored away because Emma couldn't bear to sort through them at the time, and had never found the emotional energy to return. Now, standing in front of Unit 17, with Jake and Grace Parker beside her, she wondered what other revelations awaited her in the accumulated detritus of her family's past. The roll-up door squealed in protest as she raised it, revealing stacks of cardboard boxes labeled, in her own hurried handwriting from 2018, Mom's clothes, kitchen, stuff. papers and books. The boxes looked smaller than she remembered, as if 5 years of storage had somehow compressed her mother's entire life into a manageable collection of containers. "What exactly are we looking for?" Jake asked, helping her move boxes into the daylight where they could examine the contents. "I'm not sure," Emma admitted. But Buck's letters mentioned strange phone calls and visitors in the months before he left. "If something was bothering him that much, your grandmother might have noticed it too." Grace opened the box labeled Papers and Books, while Emma tackled her mother's personal effects. Sarah Hanley had been a methodical woman who saved everything: receipts, letters, newspaper clippings, ticket stubs from the occasional movie in Durango. Emma had forgotten how her mother documented their lives with the careful attention of someone who understood that memory was fragile and required physical reminders to survive. "Emma," Grace said quietly, "you should look at this." She was holding a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore Sarah's name in gold lettering, a Christmas gift from Buck in what must have been happier times. Emma took the journal and opened it to the first entry, dated January 1st, 1995. Sarah's handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of someone who'd learned to write with fountain pens and had never abandoned the habit of careful formation. New Year's Day. "Buck seems more settled this year, less troubled by whatever has been bothering him since the summer. Emma is doing well in school, though she grows more independent every day. Sometimes I catch Buck watching her with such sadness, as if he's already mourning her leaving us." Emma flipped through several months of entries, most of them recording the ordinary events of ranch life: cattle prices, weather patterns, Emma's school activities. But as she read deeper into 1995, a different tone began to emerge. March 15th, Buck received another phone call today, the third this week. When I asked who was calling, he said it was insurance salesman, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time after hanging up, watching the road as if he expected someone to drive up. April 2nd. A man came to the house today while Buck was out checking the north pasture. He said he was from the county assessor's office, but he didn't have any identification, and his questions seemed more focused on Buck's schedule than on property values. I told him Buck would be back after dinner, but he said he'd call later. He never did. Jake had been reading over Emma's shoulder, and now he pointed to an entry from late April. "Look at this one, April 28th. Buck has been having nightmares again, the kind he used to have right after we were married. He wakes up sweating and won't tell me what he dreamed about. This morning I found him in the kitchen at 4 a.m. cleaning his rifle. When I asked why, he said he thought he'd heard something outside. But I was awake too, and I didn't hear anything except the wind." Emma felt a cold certainty settling in her chest. These weren't the writings of a woman whose husband was planning to abandon his family. These were the observations of someone who recognized that her husband was frightened. "Keep reading," Grace urged. The entries from summer 1995 painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Strange vehicles parked on the road near their property. Phone calls that came at odd hours and ended abruptly when Sarah answered. Buck taking different routes to town, checking the mirrors obsessively, installing new locks on doors that had never been locked before. July 12th, Buck told me today that if anything ever happened to him, I should take Emma and go to my sister's place in Denver. He said it like he was discussing the weather, but his hands were shaking when he lit his cigarette. I asked him what he thought might happen, and he said probably nothing. But a man had to be prepared. I've never seen him this frightened, not even during the worst years. "Mom," Jake said softly, "did you know about any of this when you were growing up?" Emma shook her head, though fragments of memory were beginning to surface. The new locks. Buck's sudden interest in teaching her to shoot. The way he'd started walking her to the school bus stop instead of letting her go alone. She'd been 16 in 1995, absorbed in her own teenage concerns. But now she wondered how she could have missed the signs of her father's growing paranoia. "There's someone here to see you," Grace said. Looking toward the storage facility's entrance, Emma turned to see a man approaching, maybe 60 years old. with the kind of careful posture that suggested either military service or chronic back pain. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "Emma Morrison?" he asked. "I'm Marcus Webb. I was a friend of your father's." Emma studied his face, searching for recognition and finding none. "I don't remember Buck mentioning anyone named Marcus. We knew each other professionally. I was a private investigator, did some work for the sheriff's department back in the day. Tom Caldwell said you were in town asking questions about Buck's disappearance. What kind of questions did you and my father work on together?" Marcus glanced at Jake and Grace, then back at Emma. The kind that kept him awake at night for the last 20 years of his life. "If you want answers about why Buck left, we should probably talk somewhere private." Emma felt Jake tense beside her, his protective instincts kicking in. Her son might be only 17, but he'd inherited Buck's ability to sense when a situation was turning serious. "Anything you can tell me, you can say in front of my son," she said. Marcus nodded slowly. "All right. But you might want to sit down for this." He gestured toward a concrete bench outside the storage office, and they all moved over to it. Marcus remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that definitely suggested military training. "Your father wasn't just a rancher and part-time deputy," he began. "In the early 80s, he helped me investigate a case that went very wrong. People died, Emma, important people. And the men responsible for those deaths spent 30 years trying to make sure the truth never came out." Emma thought about the map in Buck's pocket. The red X's marking locations from 1982. What kind of case? Missing persons. A family that disappeared without a trace. Buck thought he could solve it. Thought he could get justice for people who couldn't get justice anywhere else. Marcus looked out toward the red rock cliffs surrounding Mesa Ridge, his expression distant and troubled. Instead, he opened a door that should have stayed closed. And when Buck finally decided to walk through that door 10 years ago, it got him killed. Marcus Webb's office occupied the second floor of a building that had housed everything from a dentist's practice to a computer repair shop over the years. Now it served as the headquarters for Webb investigations. Though Marcus admitted he'd been mostly retired since his wife's death 3 years earlier, the walls were covered with maps, photographs, and what Jake whispered looked like detective movie stuff, strings connecting pushpins, timeline charts, boxes of files labeled with case numbers and dates. But it was the corner devoted to Buck Hanley that drew Emma's attention immediately. "You kept all of this?" she asked, staring at a bulletin board covered with photographs. "Police reports, and newspaper clippings spanning more than 30 years. Buck was my partner on the most important case of my career," Marcus said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "When someone like that disappears, you don't just file it away and forget about it." He pulled a thick manila folder from a filing cabinet and set it on his desk. The tab read, "Valdez, 1983, active." "Tell me what you know about the Valdez family," Marcus said to Emma. "Nothing. I've never heard that name before. Your father spent 30 years. Wishing he could say the same thing. Marcus opened the folder and removed a police report dated March 15th, 1983. The document was typed on an old manual typewriter, the kind that left slightly uneven impressions in the paper. At the top, in the section marked Investigating Officer, was Buck's name and badge number. Miguel Valdez, 34. Elena Valdez, 31. Children Sophia, age 8, and David, age 6. They lived in a trailer about 10 miles west of here, near the old Whispering Pines mine. Miguel worked construction. Elena cleaned houses in town. Solid family, no criminal history, no enemies anyone could identify. Emma studied the photographs clipped to the front of the report. The Valdez family looked like any working-class family from the 1980s. Miguel in a plaid shirt and jeans, Elena wearing a simple dress, the children gap-toothed and smiling for the camera. They could have been neighbors, friends, people she might have known if circumstances had been different. What happened to them? That's what Buck spent the rest of his life trying to figure out. On March 12, 1983, Miguel didn't show up for work. His supervisor drove out to the trailer to check on him. Found the front door standing open, breakfast still on the table, Elena's purse on the counter with her wallet and keys inside. No signs of struggle, no indication of where they might have gone. Jake leaned forward in his chair, caught up in the mystery despite himself. They just vanished? Completely. Buck interviewed everyone who knew them, checked hospitals and morgues in a 3-state area, contacted relatives in Mexico. Nothing. It was like the family had simply evaporated. Marcus turned several pages in the file, revealing dozens of interview reports, evidence logs and follow-up investigations. Emma could see Buck's signature on many of the documents, his handwriting growing less careful as the case dragged on without resolution. This consumed him, Marcus continued. Buck was young then, maybe 28, and he believed that every case could be solved if you just worked hard enough and cared enough. The Valdez disappearance taught him otherwise. Emma remembered her father's obsessive attention to detail, the way he would worry at a problem like a dog with a bone until he found an answer or exhausted every possibility. She could imagine how a case like this would have haunted him, especially early in his career when he still believed in absolute justice. But what does this have to do with his death 10 years ago? Marcus pulled out a second file, this one much thinner. In 2012, Buck came to me with new information about the Valdez case. Someone had contacted him, claimed to have knowledge about what happened to the family. Who? That's where things get complicated. Buck was secretive about his source, said it was someone who couldn't afford to be identified. But whatever this person told him was enough to convince Buck that the family hadn't left voluntarily. They'd been murdered. Emma felt the familiar chill she'd been experiencing ever since arriving in Mesa Ridge. By who? Buck thought he knew, but he couldn't prove it. And the people he suspected weren't the kind you accused without absolute certainty. We're talking about prominent local businessmen, people with the money and connections to make problems disappear. Grace Parker, who had been quietly listening from a chair near the window, spoke up for the first time since they'd arrived at Marcus's office. The kind of people who might make threatening phone calls to someone getting too close to the truth. Exactly, Marcus said. Buck was convinced that the Valdez family had discovered something they weren't supposed to know. Maybe they'd seen something at the mine or overheard a conversation they weren't meant to hear. Whatever it was, it got them killed. Emma thought about the map in Buck's pocket. The red X's marking locations from 1982 and 1983. The places he marked on that map, were they connected to the investigation? Some of them. Buck had a theory that the family's bodies were buried somewhere in the desert, probably in an old mine shaft or a wash that would flood during the monsoons. He spent months checking possible burial sites. Marcus pulled out a topographical map, similar to the one found with Buck's remains, but this one was covered with green and blue markings, in addition to the red X's Emma had seen. Green marks were places we searched together in the 80s. Blue marks were places Buck checked on his own over the years. But the red marks, those were new locations his informant had suggested. Jake pointed to a cluster of red X's near Black Mesa. That's where you found Grandpa. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. Buck finally found what he was looking for. The question is whether he found it in time to do anything about it. Emma stared at the map, trying to process the implications of what Marcus was telling her. You think whoever killed the Valdez family also killed my father? I think Buck got too close to the truth, and someone decided he needed to be stopped. The same someone who'd been making those threatening phone calls your mother wrote about in her diary. But why wait so long? If these people were worried about Buck exposing them, why not kill him in the 80s, when he was actively investigating? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Because back then, Buck was just a small-town deputy with a theory he couldn't prove. By 2013, he had evidence. Real evidence that could put powerful people in prison for the rest of their lives. Emma felt Jake's hand slip into hers, a gesture of comfort that reminded her how young he still was, despite his mature facade. Her son was learning that the world contained layers of darkness he'd never imagined, that sometimes good people died simply for trying to do the right thing. What happened to the evidence Buck found? That's what we need to figure out, Marcus said. Because if Buck hid it somewhere before he was killed, it might still be out there. And if it is, then your father's death might not have been in vain. He closed the Valdez file and looked directly at Emma. The question is whether you're willing to finish what your father started, knowing that it might put you and Jake in the same danger that got Buck killed. The call came at 2 a.m, jolting Emma from a restless sleep in her room at the Mesa Ridge Inn. Grace Parker's voice sounded strained and frightened. "Emma, I'm sorry to wake you, but something's happened out at our place. Can you come out here? And maybe bring Sheriff Caldwell." 20 minutes later, Emma and Tom were following Grace's truck down the dark dirt road toward the Parker homestead, their headlights cutting through the high desert night. Jake had wanted to come along, but Emma had insisted he stay at the hotel. Whatever was happening, she didn't want her son walking into it blind. The Parker place looked different in the darkness, less welcoming than it had during their afternoon visit. Solar-powered security lights cast harsh shadows across the yard, and Emma could see David Parker standing near the barn with what looked like a rifle cradled in his arms. "What's going on?" Tom asked as they climbed out of his patrol car. "Someone's been digging," Grace said, leading them toward the well site. David heard machinery around midnight, sounded like a backhoe or excavator. By the time he got dressed and came outside, they were gone. The crime scene tape had been torn down and scattered across the ground. Where the carefully backfilled hole had been, someone had dug a new excavation, deeper and wider than the original well shaft. Piles of red dirt surrounded the site, and heavy equipment tracks were clearly visible in the beam of Tom's flashlight. "They were looking for something," David Parker said, joining the group. This wasn't random vandalism. They knew exactly where to dig. Emma stared into the hole, which was now deep enough to require a ladder to reach the bottom. Did they find anything? Hard to say. But they left some of their equipment behind when they heard us coming. David led them to a pile of gear stacked near the barn, professional-grade metal detectors, soil sieves, and excavation tools that looked far more sophisticated than anything a casual treasure hunter would use. Attached to one of the metal detectors was a business card in a clear plastic sleeve. Tom picked up the card and read it aloud. "Desert Recovery Services, specializing in archaeological and forensic excavation." There was a phone number with a Phoenix area code and a logo showing a stylized petroglyph. "Phoenix," Emma said. "And that's a long way to come for a random dig." Grace and David exchanged a look that Emma caught in her peripheral vision. There was something in that glance, a flicker of recognition or guilt, that made her suddenly wary. "Grace," she said carefully, "is there something you haven't told us about why you chose this particular piece of land?" Another look between the couple, longer this time. Finally, Grace sighed and sat down heavily on a pile of lumber near the barn. "We weren't entirely honest with you," she admitted. "David and I didn't just randomly decide to homestead out here. We were hired to find this specific location." Tom's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. "Hired by who?" "A company in Phoenix. They said they were doing archaeological research, looking for evidence of prehistoric settlements in this area. They offered us $5,000 to establish a homestead here and do some careful excavation work." Emma felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. "Archaeological research. Is that what you call it when you're looking for bodies?" David Parker stepped closer to his wife, his rifle still in his hands but pointed safely at the ground. "We had no idea we'd find human remains. When Grace's shovel hit that belt buckle, we were as shocked as anyone. But you reported it properly," Tom said. "You called it in, followed protocol." "Because we're not criminals," Grace said firmly. "Whatever Desert Recovery Services was really looking for, it wasn't worth hiding a man's death." Emma thought about the timing, the coincidences that were beginning to feel less coincidental. "How long ago were you contacted by this company?" "About 18 months ago, right after we started talking about leaving the city and trying the homestead life. And they just happened to contact you. Out of all the people in the world who might want to try off-grid living in southwestern Colorado." Grace's silence was answer enough. Emma felt Marcus Webb's warnings echoing in her mind. Powerful people with the money and connections to make problems disappear. Apparently, they also had the resources to orchestrate elaborate schemes involving unwitting homesteaders and fake archaeological companies. They knew, Emma said, more to herself than to the others. Somehow, they knew Buck had found evidence related to the Valdez case. They've been looking for it. Tom holstered his weapon and pulled out his cell phone. I'm calling for backup and crime scene techs. This site is now part of an active investigation. While Tom made his calls, Emma walked around the excavation site, trying to piece together what had happened. The professional quality of the equipment, the systematic way the hole had been expanded, the careful removal of soil. This wasn't the work of vandals or amateur treasure hunters. Someone with serious resources had invested significant time and money in finding whatever Buck had hidden out here. "Emma!" Grace called from near the barn. "There's something else." She was holding a piece of paper that had been weighted down under one of the metal detectors. In the beam of Emma's flashlight, she could see it was a note written in block letters with a black marker. "Stop looking or join your father." Jake's face flashed through Emma's mind. Her son sleeping peacefully back at the hotel, unaware that his decision to investigate his grandfather's death had put them both in danger. She thought about Marcus Webb's question. Was she willing to finish what Buck had started, knowing it might put her and Jake at risk? Standing in the desert darkness, surrounded by evidence of her father's final desperate attempt to find justice, Emma realized the choice had already been made for her. Buck had died protecting his family from people who were still out there, still dangerous, still willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. "Tom," she called as the sheriff finished his phone conversation. "How long before your backup gets here?" 20 minutes, maybe 30. Why?" "Because I think we need to get Jake and leave town tonight. These people know we're here. They know what we're looking for, and they've just told us they're willing to kill to stop us." David Parker stepped forward, his expression serious. "Grace and I owe you an apology, and probably more than that. We didn't know what we were getting into when we took that company's money, but we're not going to stand by and let anything happen to you or your son." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we know this country better than any hired thugs from Phoenix. And we've got resources they don't know about. Off-grid communication equipment, security systems, hiding places that don't show up on any map." Grace nodded in agreement. "Your father protected you by leaving. Maybe it's time for us to protect you by staying and fighting." Emma looked at the threatening note in her hands. Then at the faces around her. Tom Caldwell with his weathered integrity. Grace and David Parker with their hard-won competence. The desert landscape that had shaped her childhood and now threatened to claim her life. Buck had run into this wilderness to face his demons alone. But Emma didn't have to make the same choice. She had allies, resources, and something Buck had never possessed, the knowledge of what she was really fighting against. "All right," she said finally, "but we do this smart. No unnecessary risks and no heroics. We find Buck's evidence, expose the truth about the Valdez family, and make sure these people can never hurt anyone else." In the distance, the wail of approaching sirens echoed off the red rock cliffs, and Emma realized there was no going back now. The brass key had been easy to miss among Buck's other personal effects, a small, tarnished thing that hung from a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt when the remains were discovered. It wasn't until Emma examined his belongings for the third time, searching for clues to match the locations on his hand-drawn map, that she noticed the key didn't match any lock she remembered from the ranch house or Buck's vehicles. Marcus Webb studied the key under a magnifying glass in his office, turning it over in his weathered hands. "This is old," he said. "Maybe turn of the century. The kind they used for safety deposit boxes or private strong boxes. But there's no bank out here that would have boxes this old," Emma said. "No bank, maybe, but there are other possibilities." Marcus pulled out a different map, this one showing the mining claims and underground workings that honeycombed the area around Mesa Ridge. Red lines indicated known tunnels and shafts. Blue lines showed abandoned workings, and green lines marked areas that had been sealed off due to safety concerns. "The Whispering Pines mine," he said, pointing to a location near where the Valdez family had lived. It was a silver operation that closed down in the 1940s. The main shaft was sealed, but there were always rumors about secondary tunnels that the mining company never officially mapped. Emma traced the route from the Parker homestead to the mine on Buck's hand-drawn map. 3 of his red X marks fell along the path between the 2 locations, and she realized he'd been mapping not just search areas, but a specific route to something he'd discovered. "He found their bodies," she said quietly. "The Valdez family. He found them in the mine." Jake looked up from the stack of police reports he'd been reading. "If he found them, why didn't he report it? Why keep it secret for 30 years? Marcus and Emma exchanged a look. The same thought had occurred to both of them, but neither wanted to voice it in front of Jake. There was only one reason Buck would have kept such a discovery secret, because he'd known that. Reporting it would put his own family in danger, because whoever killed them was still alive, Emma said finally. Still powerful enough to threaten anyone who got too close to the truth. Tom Caldwell had been monitoring radio traffic all morning, coordinating with state police and federal agents who were taking over the investigation into Desert Recovery Services. Now he approached Marcus's desk with a grim expression. "Got some interesting news from Phoenix," he said. "Desert Recovery Services is a legitimate company. They do archaeological and forensic work for law enforcement and private clients. But according to their records, they never hired anyone to do excavation work near Mesa Ridge." "Someone was using their name," Marcus said. "Gets better. The phone number on that business card traces to a burner phone that was purchased in Albuquerque 6 months ago. Paid for with cash, registered to a fake address." Emma felt the familiar chill of realization. They'd been planning this for months, ever since Buck's body was discovered, or longer, Tom said. "Emma, I think we need to consider the possibility that Buck's death wasn't random, that someone lured him out to that location specifically. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire." Emma thought about the letters Buck had written but never sent, his growing paranoia in the months before he disappeared, the way he'd preserved the ranch for her despite their estrangement. All of it painted a picture of a man preparing for a confrontation he didn't expect to survive. "We need to find that mine," she said. "Absolutely not," Tom replied immediately. "If there's evidence down there, we'll get a proper team together. Crime scene techs, mining safety experts, the whole works. And how long will that take? How many phone calls and bureaucratic approvals and jurisdictional disputes? Meanwhile, the people who killed Buck are still out there, still looking for whatever he found." Marcus stood up slowly, his old joints protesting. "Emma's right, Tom. Every day we wait gives them more time to cover their tracks. Buck spent 30 years trying to get justice for the Valdez family through official channels. Look where it got him. The mine entrance was hidden behind a curtain of juniper and sage, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Buck's map had been precise, 47 paces north from a distinctive red rock formation, then 15 paces west to a gap in the cliff face that was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Emma, Jake Marcus and Grace Parker had hiked in from a back road, carrying headlamps, rope, and basic cave exploration equipment. Tom had insisted on coming along despite his reservations, bringing a radio and enough backup gear to equip a small expedition. "This is it," Emma said, consulting Buck's map one more time. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen rocks and decades of debris, but she could see where someone had recently cleared a path through the obstruction. "Buck's been here," Marcus observed, pointing to boot prints in the sandy soil near the entrance. "These prints are old, but not 30 years old. Maybe 10. The passage beyond the entrance sloped downward at a steep angle, carved from the living rock by miners who'd followed a silver vein deep into the heart of Black Mesa. Their headlamps revealed tool marks on the walls, rusted mining equipment abandoned when the claim played out, and the kind of absolute darkness that existed only underground. How far does this go?" Jake asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "According to the old mining maps, maybe 300 feet, Marcus replied. But those maps weren't always accurate. The miners followed the ore wherever it led. They moved carefully through the tunnel, checking the stability of the rock overhead and testing each step before committing their full weight. Emma could smell the mineral tang of deep earth, the metallic residue of old mining operations, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made her stomach clench. The tunnel opened into a natural chamber about the size of a large room, with passages leading off in 3 directions. But it was the evidence of recent human activity that drew their attention immediately. Someone had set up a workspace in the chamber, a folding table, battery-powered lights, plastic storage bins carefully arranged along one wall. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, suggesting it had been undisturbed for years. "This is Buck's place," Emma said, recognizing her father's methodical organization in the careful arrangement of equipment and supplies. She approached the storage bins, her heart hammering as she contemplated what she might find inside. The first bin contained police reports, photographs, and evidence bags, all related to the Valdez case. The second held camping gear and non-perishable food, enough to sustain someone for several days of underground work. The third bin was locked with a small padlock that looked like it would match the brass key from Buck's necklace. Emma's hands shook as she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open, and she lifted the lid to reveal the contents that had consumed the last 10 years of her father's life. Bones. Human bones. Carefully arranged and catalogued, with evidence tags written in Buck's precise handwriting. Adult and child remains, just as Marcus had predicted. But there was more. Personal effects that had survived 30 years in the desert. A child's silver bracelet with Sophia engraved on the nameplate. A man's wallet with Miguel Valdez's driver's license still visible through the plastic window. Jake stepped back from the bin, his face pale in the harsh LED light. "Are those the missing family?" "Yeah," Marcus said softly. "Buck found them." But Emma was staring at something else in the bin, a manila envelope thick with documents. She pulled it out and opened it carefully, revealing photographs, bank records, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of events surrounding the Valdez disappearance. The photographs showed the mining chamber where they stood, but also included images of the site where the family's bodies had originally been buried. Emma could see that Buck had excavated the remains carefully, documenting everything with the thoroughness of a trained investigator. The bank records were more puzzling. Photocopies of large cash transactions dating from 1983, all involving accounts that belonged to prominent Mesa Ridge businessmen. The amounts were significant. Tens of thousands of dollars changing hands in the weeks following the Valdez family's disappearance. But it was the timeline that made Emma's blood run cold. Buck had documented a pattern of payments to various individuals over a period of several months in 1983. The payments had started small but grown larger as time passed, and they were all connected to something called Mesa Ridge Development Corporation. "Grace," Emma called. "Come look at this." Grace approached the bin reluctantly, her own face pale as she saw the remains of the family she'd helped discover above ground. "Do you recognize this company name? Mesa Ridge Development Corporation?" Grace studied the documents, her expression growing troubled. "That's the company that hired us. Not Desert Recovery Services, that was just the name they gave us. The actual payments came from Mesa Ridge Development Corporation." The realization hit Emma like a physical blow. "They're still operating. The people who killed the Valdez family are still here, still covering their tracks, still powerful enough to manipulate people into doing their dirty work." Marcus had been examining other documents from the envelope, and now he held up a letter written in Buck's handwriting. "Emma, you need to read this." The letter was addressed to her, dated just 2 weeks before Buck's disappearance. "Emma, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it back from my meeting with the people responsible for the Valdez murders. I've spent 30 years trying to bring them to justice through legal channels, but they're too well connected, too careful. They've been blackmailing me for the past year, threatening to hurt you and Jake if I don't stop my investigation. I can't live with that anymore. I'm going to confront them directly, try to end this once and for all. The evidence is all here, everything you need to expose them. Don't try to be a hero like your old man. Take this to the FBI, let them handle it. I love you, and I'm sorry for all the years we lost. Emma sank down on a pile of mining equipment, the letter trembling in her hands. Buck hadn't abandoned his family. He'd tried to protect them the only way he knew how. By facing his enemies alone in the desert where no one else could be hurt, he was blackmailed, she said, her voice barely audible in the underground chamber. For years, they used us against him. Jake knelt beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders with a maturity that reminded her painfully of Buck. He loved us. Mom, he died trying to protect us. Above ground, they could hear the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Tom's backup finally arriving, or perhaps something more sinister. Emma looked around the chamber one more time, at the evidence her father had spent years gathering, at the truth he'd died trying to reveal. Buck's investigation was finished. Now it was time for justice. The digital recorder was hidden in the deepest corner of the chamber, wrapped in plastic and tucked behind a support beam where only someone who knew to look for it would ever find it. Emma discovered it when she was repacking Buck's evidence bins, her fingers encountering the small device while feeling around in the darkness beyond their headlamp's reach. "Marcus," she called, her voice echoing strangely in the underground space. "There's something else here." The recorder was one of those small digital devices that journalists and students used for interviews, the kind that could store hours of audio in a memory chip smaller than a fingernail. A piece of surgical tape held a folded paper to the back of the device, with "For Emma" written in Buck's careful handwriting. Emma's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. It contained a single line of instruction. Listen to this alone. Jake was examining the Valdez family's remains with the soberness of someone far older than his 17 years, while Grace and Tom consulted the mining maps to determine the safest route back to the surface. Marcus noticed Emma's expression and moved closer. "What is it?" "A recording. Buck left it for me specifically." She held up the note. "He says to listen to it alone." Marcus glanced around the chamber, calculating distances and sight lines. "There's another passage over there, maybe 30 feet deep. We could still hear you if you called out, but you'd have privacy for whatever Buck wanted to tell you." Emma nodded and made her way to the secondary tunnel, a natural formation that had been partially excavated by miners looking for a continuation of the silver vein. She settled onto a flat rock and turned on the recorder, Buck's voice immediately filling the confined space with the weight of 10 years' silence. "Emma, if you're hearing this, then I'm dead, and you found my investigation into the Valdez murders. I want you to know that everything I did in the last years of my life was to protect you and your mother from the people responsible for this crime." Buck's voice sounded older than she remembered, heavy with fatigue and regret. In the background, she could hear the sounds of the underground chamber, the drip of water somewhere in the darkness, the subtle echo that came from speaking in a confined space. "I found the Valdez family's remains in 2003, almost 20 years after they disappeared. They were buried in a sealed section of this mine, along with evidence that showed they'd been murdered by people who wanted to control the mineral rights in this area. Miguel Valdez had discovered that his trailer was sitting on top of a significant rare earth mineral deposit, the kind that's worth millions if you know how to extract it properly." Emma paused the recording, her mind racing. Rare earth minerals were used in everything from electronics to renewable energy systems. In 2003, they would have been valuable. Today, they were worth a fortune. She pressed play again. The Valdez family was killed because they refused to sell their land for what it was worth. Miguel had done his research, knew about the mineral deposit, and wanted fair compensation. Instead of negotiating, the people behind Mesa Ridge Development Corporation decided it would be cheaper to eliminate the problem permanently. Buck's voice paused, and Emma could hear him moving around the chamber, the scrape of equipment being shifted, I've spent 10 years building a case against them. But every time I got close to presenting evidence to federal authorities, something would happen. Witnesses would disappear, records would vanish, and I'd get threatening phone calls. They made it clear that you and Sarah were targets if I didn't back down. Emma thought about her mother's diary entries, the paranoia and fear that had consumed Buck in his final years at home. He'd been living under threat for most of Emma's teenage years, protecting his family the only way he knew how, by staying silent about the murders he'd discovered. A year ago, things changed. Someone new took control of Mesa Ridge Development Corporation, someone who decided that having me around was too risky. They started demanding that I turn over all my evidence or face consequences. I tried to negotiate, tried to find a middle ground, but they made it clear that the only acceptable outcome was my silence or my death. The recording paused again, longer this time. When Buck's voice resumed, it carried a note of finality that made Emma's chest tighten. I've decided to meet with them one final time, to try to convince them that I'll keep their secrets if they leave my family alone. I don't expect this meeting to go well. I think they've already decided that I know too much to live. But maybe if I go willingly, if I don't put up a fight, they'll believe that I never told anyone else about what I discovered. Emma realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her father plan his own death in order to protect her. If something happens to me, Emma, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I know I was a difficult father, especially in your teenage years. I was drinking too much, keeping too many secrets, carrying too much anger about things I couldn't control. I pushed you away because I thought distance would keep you safe. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right about that. She could hear Buck moving closer to the recorder, his voice becoming more intimate and immediate. The person I'm meeting tonight is someone you trust, someone who's been part of our community for decades. Tom Caldwell has been feeding information to Mesa Ridge Development Corporation since the early days of my investigation. He's the one who told them about the Valdez family's discovery. He's the one who made sure the original investigation went nowhere, and he's the one who's been monitoring my progress for the past 30 years. Emma's blood turned to ice. Tom Caldwell, the sheriff who'd called her about Buck's death, who'd guided her investigation, who was currently in the main chamber with Jake and her allies. Tom, who'd insisted on coming to the mine despite his supposed reservations about the danger. Buck's voice continued. Unaware of the terror his revelation was causing, Tom called me yesterday, said he had new information about the Valdez case. Information that would help me finally close it. He wants to meet at Devil's Canyon, the place where Miguel Valdez used to take his children fishing. I know it's a trap, Emma, but I can't keep running from this. I'm tired of living in fear, tired of watching my family suffer because of secrets I can't share. The recording picked up the sound of Buck checking equipment, the metallic clicks of a revolver being loaded. I'm not going to this meeting unarmed, but I'm not planning to shoot anyone either. If Tom wants to kill me, he'll have to do it in cold blood, knowing that I won't fight back. Maybe that will be enough to satisfy whoever's pulling his strings. Maybe they'll leave you alone after I'm gone. Emma heard footsteps in the recording. Buck moving toward what must have been the chamber entrance. I love you. Emma, I love Jake, even though I never got to know him properly. Take care of each other and don't try to avenge me. Just live your lives, be happy, and know that your old man finally did something right. The recording ended with the click of the device being turned off. Emma sat in the darkness of the tunnel, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd just learned. Tom Caldwell, the man she'd trusted with her life, with Jake's life, was the one responsible for Buck's death, and he was currently in the main chamber, armed and in a position to eliminate everyone who'd heard Buck's evidence. Emma turned off the recorder and slipped it into her pocket, forcing herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. She needed to warn the others without alerting Tom to what she'd discovered. She needed to get Jake to safety, and somehow she needed to ensure that Buck's evidence survived even if she didn't. As she made her way back toward the main chamber, Emma could hear voices, Tom talking to Marcus about the best route to the surface, Grace discussing the mining maps with professional competence. Normal conversation that masked the deadly reality of their situation. Jake looked up as she emerged from the tunnel, his expression immediately concerned. "Mom, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," she managed, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "Ready to get out of here?" Tom approached with his radio in hand. "Bad news. The backup team is having trouble with the access road. Looks like someone's blocked it with fallen trees. They're going to have to hike in, which means another hour or two before they reach us." Emma met Marcus's eyes across the chamber, saw the older investigator's expression sharpen as he recognized the warning in her gaze. Marcus had spent decades reading people, understanding the subtle signals that meant danger was imminent. "Maybe we should wait for them on the surface," Marcus suggested casually. "Let the professionals handle the evidence recovery." "Good idea," Tom agreed, his hand resting on his service weapon. "But first, Emma, did your father's recording have anything useful? Any names or specific information we should know about?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Emma realized that Tom knew about the recorder, had been waiting for her to discover it and reveal its contents. He'd been playing a longer game than any of them had imagined. "Nothing specific," she lied. "Just personal stuff. Apologies and regrets." Tom's smile was perfectly friendly, perfectly normal, and absolutely terrifying. "That's too bad. I was hoping Buck might have finally identified the people responsible for the Valdez murders." Emma looked at Jake, at Marcus, at Grace, good people who'd trusted her judgment and followed her into this underground trap. Buck had died trying to protect his family. Now she had to find a way to protect hers. The chamber that had promised answers had become a tomb, and the only way out led directly through the man who'd killed her father. Emma's hand closed around Buck's service revolver where she'd found it in the evidence bin, still wrapped in the same plastic bag that had protected it for 10 years. The weapon was loaded but unfired, exactly as Buck had left it when he went to meet Tom Caldwell in Devil's Canyon. Her father had chosen to face his killer unarmed, believing that refusing to fight might save his family from retaliation. Emma made a different choice. "Tom," she said, standing up slowly with the revolver behind her back, "I need to ask you something about the night my father died." The sheriff's expression remained perfectly composed, but Emma caught the slight tightening around his eyes that Marcus had taught her to watch for, the tell that revealed when someone was calculating their next move. "Of course, Emma, anything that might help us understand what happened. Buck left a recording. He said he was meeting someone he trusted, someone who'd been part of the community for decades, someone who'd been feeding information to Mesa Ridge Development Corporation for 30 years. Tom's hand moved toward his weapon with professional smoothness, but Marcus was already in motion. The old investigator grabbed a battery-powered lantern from the folding table and hurled it at Tom's gun hand, sending the sheriff's weapon clattering across the stone floor. "Jake, get behind those rocks," Emma shouted, bringing Buck's revolver around to point at Tom's chest. "Grace, the tunnel, go now!" But Tom was faster than his age suggested, rolling toward his fallen weapon while pulling a backup pistol from an ankle holster. The chamber erupted in the deafening chaos of gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing against the stone walls like lightning in a cave. Emma dove for cover behind the evidence bins, Buck's revolver heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. She'd learned to shoot as a teenager, but that had been tin cans and target practice. Not a life-or-death confrontation in an underground chamber with her son's life hanging in the balance. "You should have listened to your father," Tom called from behind a pile of mining equipment. He understood the situation. He knew when to walk away. "Buck never walked away from anything important," Emma replied, trying to keep him talking while she figured out their tactical situation. "That's why you had to kill him." Tom's laugh echoed strangely in the confined space. "I didn't want to kill Buck. I liked him, respected him. But he couldn't leave well enough alone. 30 years of poking at something that should have stayed buried." Marcus had taken cover near the chamber entrance, his own weapon drawn, a small pistol that looked like it had seen considerable use. How much did they pay you, Tom? What's the going rate for a sheriff's conscience these days? More than you'd make in a lifetime chasing insurance fraud and cheating spouses, Marcus. Mesa Ridge Development Corporation understands the value of long-term investments. They've been very generous over the years. Emma could see Jake crouched behind a formation of natural stone, his young face pale but determined. Her son was too exposed, too vulnerable if Tom decided to change positions. She needed to end this quickly. The Valdez family, she called out. They discovered the rare earth deposits, didn't they? That's what this was really about. Miguel Valdez was a stubborn man, Tom replied. He hired a geological survey, found out what his land was really worth, demanded 10 times what Mesa Ridge Development was offering. Some people don't understand reasonable negotiation. Grace's voice came from the tunnel entrance, breathless but controlled. So you murdered them. An entire family, including 2 children. I didn't murder anyone, Tom said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine defensiveness. That was handled by professionals from Phoenix. I just made sure the investigation didn't go anywhere inconvenient. Emma felt a cold fury building in her chest. Tom was talking about the Valdez children, like they were acceptable collateral damage, obstacles to be removed, rather than human beings with lives and dreams and futures that had been stolen from them. And Buck? Was he also handled by professionals from Phoenix? The pause that followed was answer enough. When Tom spoke again, his voice had hardened. Buck chose to meet me alone. He chose to walk into Devil's Canyon without backup. He made it easy. Emma rose from behind the evidence bins, Buck's revolver steady in her hands. He trusted you. He thought you were his friend. I was his friend. That's why I made it quick. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Emma realized that Tom had been carrying his own burden of guilt for 10 years. He'd betrayed a man who trusted him, killed someone he genuinely cared about, all for money and the approval of people who viewed him as just another asset to be managed. "It's over, Tom," she said. "The evidence is here, the recording exists, and too many people know the truth for you to cover it up anymore." Tom stepped out from behind his cover, his weapon raised but his expression oddly relieved. Maybe that's for the best. "I'm tired of keeping their secrets." For a moment Emma thought he might surrender. Then she saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw him swing the gun toward Jake's position, and knew that Tom Caldwell had decided to take her family with him rather than face the consequences of 30 years of corruption. Emma fired Buck's revolver twice, the massive .357 rounds echoing like thunder in the stone chamber. Tom staggered backward, his own shot going wide, striking the ceiling and bringing down a shower of rock dust. He fell heavily beside the evidence bins, his blood mixing with the red dirt of the desert that had claimed so many secrets over the years. "Mom," Jake called, his voice shaking. "Is it over?" Emma looked down at Tom Caldwell, at the man who'd killed her father and terrorized her family for money. Buck's revolver was still smoking in her hands, and she realized that unlike her father, she'd been willing to fight back when the people she loved were threatened. "Yeah," she said finally. "It's over." Emma's childhood locket lay broken on the stone floor of the chamber. Its delicate gold chain snapped during her desperate dive for cover. The heart-shaped pendant had been a gift from Buck on her 8th birthday, inscribed with "Daddy's Girl" in his careful handwriting. She'd worn it every day until their relationship soured, then kept it hidden in her jewelry box like a relic of happier times. Now, as she knelt beside Tom Caldwell's still form, Emma picked up the damaged locket and felt the weight of reconciliation in its familiar curves. Buck had given her more than jewelry all those years ago. He'd given her the tools to survive, to fight back, to protect the people she loved. "Is he dead?" Jake asked, approaching cautiously with Marcus and Grace beside him. Emma checked for a pulse and found none. "Yes." Marcus examined Tom's weapon, careful not to disturb the crime scene. "Self-defense, no question. He was going to kill all of us to protect his conspiracy." Grace was already on her radio, calling for emergency responders and state police backup. The signal was weak this far underground, but her message was getting through. Within hours, this chamber would be crawling with federal agents. forensic experts, and crime scene technicians. But Emma's attention was focused on Buck's evidence bins, on the 30 years of investigation that had cost her father his life. Tom's death had eliminated the immediate threat, but the conspiracy behind Mesa Ridge Development Corporation was larger than one corrupt sheriff. "Marcus," she said, "help me understand something. If the rare earth deposits were so valuable, why didn't Mesa Ridge Development just buy the Valdez property at fair market value? Why resort to murder?" The old investigator was photographing the crime scene with a small camera he'd carried in his equipment pack. Because in 1983, most people didn't understand what rare earth minerals were worth. Miguel Valdez was unusual. He did his research, hired that geological survey, demanded appropriate compensation. If word had gotten out about the real value of the deposits, every property owner in the area would have wanted to renegotiate their deals. Jake was examining the documents from Buck's investigation, his architectural training helping him understand the property maps and mining claims. "Look at this," he said, holding up a surveyor's report. "The mineral deposits don't just extend under the Valdez property. They run for miles in every direction, including under parts of Mesa Ridge itself." Emma studied the report, her mind working through the implications. They weren't just stealing one family's land. They were trying to control an entire region's mineral rights, and they've been succeeding for 30 years, Grace added, returning from her radio call. "Think about all the development in this area, all the properties that have changed hands at below-market prices. How many families have been pushed out by unfortunate circumstances or economic pressure?" The picture that emerged from Buck's evidence was staggering in its scope. Mesa Ridge Development Corporation hadn't just murdered the Valdez family, they'd orchestrated a decades-long campaign of intimidation, manipulation, and violence to control one of the richest rare earth deposits in the American Southwest. Emma found Buck's timeline among the documents, a careful chronology that tracked the corporation's activities from 1983 to 2013. Properties acquired under suspicious circumstances. Families that had relocated suddenly after refusing to sell. Local officials who'd become unexpectedly wealthy despite modest salaries. Tom wasn't the only one on their payroll, she realized. "They've been buying influence throughout the county for 30 years, Marcus nodded grimly. "And now that the rare earth market has exploded, their investment is paying off. We're talking about billions of dollars in mineral rights." Emma thought about Buck's final recording, his belief that confronting Tom directly might end the threats against his family. Her father had been naive about the scope of what he was fighting, but he'd been right about one thing. The truth was powerful enough to bring down even the most carefully constructed conspiracy. "We're going to finish this," she said, looking around at the faces of her allies. "All of it. Not just Tom, but everyone who's been part of this cover-up." Jake picked up the broken locket from where Emma had set it on the evidence table. "Grandpa would be proud of you," he said quietly. "You solved his case." Emma felt tears starting again. But these were different from the grief and anger that had driven her since arriving in Mesa Ridge. These were tears of understanding, of forgiveness, of a connection finally restored across 10 years of silence. "He solved it himself," she said. "He did all the hard work, gathered all the evidence, made all the connections. I just had to be brave enough to follow where he led." Marcus was securing the evidence bins for transport to the surface, treating each item with the reverence due to material that had cost so much to obtain. Buck would want this to end with justice, not just revenge. "Tom's dead, but the people who gave him orders are still out there." "Then we'll find them," Emma said, slipping the broken locket into her pocket. "All of them." As they prepared to leave the chamber that had been Buck's secret sanctuary, Emma took one last look at the place where her father had documented 30 years of patient investigation. The stone walls held no judgment, no recrimination for the years of silence between them. They simply bore witness to a man's determination to see justice done, no matter the personal cost. Buck had died believing he'd failed to protect his family, but he'd actually given them the greatest gift possible, the truth, carefully preserved and waiting for the right moment to emerge from the darkness. Emma climbed toward the surface, carrying her father's legacy and her son's future, ready to face whatever remained of the conspiracy that had shaped their lives for so long. This desert sun had never felt so warm. The funeral took place on a clear November morning when the high desert sky stretched endless and blue. Above Mesa Ridge, Buck Hanley was buried with full law enforcement honors, his casket draped with the American flag and carried by 6 deputies from surrounding counties who'd volunteered to honor a brother officer they'd never met but whose story had spread throughout the law enforcement community like wildfire. Emma stood beside the grave with Jake, Marcus Webb, and Grace Parker, watching as the honor guard folded the flag with military precision. The ceremony was simple but dignified, attended by more people than Emma had expected. Ranchers who remembered Buck from his younger days, townspeople who'd heard about his 30-year investigation, federal agents who'd spent the past month unraveling the Mesa Ridge Development Corporation conspiracy, Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos, who'd been appointed interim sheriff after Tom Caldwell's death, presented Emma with the folded flag. "On behalf of a grateful community and the law enforcement family," she said formally, "please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's service and sacrifice." Emma accepted the flag, feeling its weight as both honor and responsibility. Buck had earned this recognition through decades of patient investigation, through his refusal to abandon the Valdez family even when it cost him everything. The burial was followed by a reception at the Mesa Ridge Community Center, where Emma found herself surrounded by people sharing memories of her father that she'd never heard. Buck teaching neighborhood kids to rope cattle. Buck quietly paying medical bills for families who couldn't afford them. Buck spending his own money to buy Christmas presents for children whose parents were struggling. "He was a good man," said Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd run the trading post for 40 years. Troubled in his later years, but good all the way through, Jake moved through the crowd with the easy confidence he'd inherited from both sides of his family, listening to stories about the grandfather he was finally getting to know. Emma watched her son absorb these tales of Buck's generosity and integrity, saw him beginning to understand that heroes weren't perfect people. They were people who chose to do the right thing, despite their flaws and fears. "Have you decided what to do about the ranch?" Marcus asked, joining Emma at a table near the windows that looked out toward the Red Rock country. "I'm going to restore it," Emma said. "Jake and I talked about it last night. He wants to finish high school here, get to know this place properly before he goes to college." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Buck would like that. He always hoped you'd come home someday. This wasn't my home when I left, but maybe it can be now." The federal investigation had moved with surprising speed once Buck's evidence emerged from the underground chamber. Mesa Ridge Development Corporation turned out to be a shell company controlled by a consortium of investors from Phoenix, Denver, and Las Vegas, people who'd spent 30 years systematically acquiring mineral rights throughout the Southwest through intimidation, fraud, and occasional violence. Tom Caldwell had been just one part of their network, though an important one. His position as sheriff had allowed him to control local investigations, suppress evidence, and identify potential threats to the conspiracy. The Valdez family had been murdered because they'd refused to be intimidated. Buck had been killed because he'd gotten too close to exposing the truth, but the truth, once revealed, had proven unstoppable. Within 2 weeks of the underground confrontation, federal agents had arrested 17 people in 5 states on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to racketeering. The rare earth deposits would be developed eventually, but under proper legal oversight and with fair compensation for legitimate property owners. "Mom," Jake said, approaching their table with a photograph in his hands. "Grace took this during the service. I thought you'd want to see it." The photograph showed Emma and Jake standing beside Buck's grave as the honor guard folded the flag. Behind them, the mesa stretched toward the horizon, timeless and enduring. Emma was wearing her mother's best dress and the repaired locket. A jeweler in Durango had mended the chain. Though the scratches on the pendant remained as reminders of their underground battle, Jake looked serious and mature in his borrowed suit, one hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. In the photograph, their resemblance to Buck was unmistakable. The same determined jawline, the same direct gaze, the same quiet strength that had carried the Hanley family through 30 years of hidden struggle. "We look like we belong here," Jake observed. "Maybe we do," Emma said. As the reception wound down, Emma found herself standing on the community center's front steps, watching the sun set behind the western mesas. The desert landscape that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving now felt like home, not the idealized home of childhood memory, but the complex, nuanced home of adult understanding. Buck had died believing he'd failed his family, but his legacy was far more positive than he'd ever imagined. The Valdez family had finally received justice. A criminal conspiracy that had operated for 3 decades had been exposed and dismantled, and Emma had learned that love and sacrifice could transcend even the deepest misunderstandings. Jake joined her on the steps, both of them quiet as they watched the desert work its ancient magic of turning ordinary daylight into something approaching the sacred. "Do you think he knows?" Jake asked. "About what we accomplished?" Emma thought about Buck's evidence chamber, about the careful preservation of truth that had waited underground for exactly the right moment to emerge. She thought about the broken locket that had somehow survived their confrontation with Tom Caldwell, about the way her father's investigation had provided everything she'd needed to finish what he'd started. "I think he planned for this," she said finally. "All of it. He knew someday we'd find our way back to him. The desert held its secrets lightly, but it held them long." Buck Hanley had learned that lesson in his 30 years of investigation, and he'd used it to ensure that truth would eventually triumph over conspiracy, that justice would eventually overcome intimidation, and that love would eventually bridge even the widest gaps. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma and Jake went home to begin the work of rebuilding their family ranch and their family legacy. Behind them, the desert settled into its evening silence, keeping watch over the living and the dead with equal patience.